Henry VIII's tomb, and they know that in there are bodies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. That is an interesting topic on its own because there is a lost tomb of Henry VIII.
When workers unintentionally breached a long-sealed royal chamber, what they found felt more like the aftermath of disaster than a proper burial. A lead coffin lay broken apart. Bones were strewn across the vault floor. A dark, hardened substance echoed rumors whispered for centuries after the king's funeral. Most unsettling of all, a third, unidentified set of remains rested in secret beside England's most powerful rulers. Inside Henry VIII's broken tomb, there's something endlessly captivating about English kings, their lives and reigns sparking debates centuries after their deaths. And Henry VIII embodies that intrigue completely, famous for all the wrong reasons, enigmatic, and wrapped in enough mystery to keep historians guessing forever. When a surveyor finally lowered himself into the darkness with nothing but a lantern and curiosity, he wasn't expecting peace, reverence, or anything remotely dignified. Royal tombs are supposed to feel solemn, almost sacred. This one didn't. What stared back at him looked more like the aftermath of a disaster than the resting place of kings. The vault was chaos. Disturbed, broken, unsettling. It was less tomb-worthy of anyone at all. It looked more like a crime scene. At the center of it all was the coffin, or what was left of it. Henry VIII's massive lead coffin, weighing well over 1,000 pounds, had been torn apart. The thick metal casing was fractured, ripped wide in places, tilted at a strange angle as if it had been shoved from below. Long fissures ran down the lead, scars from an unseen force. And here's the detail that made everyone pause. The damage didn't come from outside the coffin. It came from within. The sealed box had built up so much internal pressure that the lead itself gave way. Imagine a slow, silent explosion unfolding underground. No witnesses, no sound, just relentless force until the metal finally surrendered. The lantern light revealed the result, and it was horrifying. Protruding from one jagged tear in the coffin was a large human bone, thick, heavy, unmistakable, part of the king's leg. And that wasn't the worst of it.
He started having real medical problems with his leg, problems that were going to plague him for the rest of his reign.
As the surveyor's light swept across the damp stone floor, more remains came into view. Smaller bones scattered like debris. Finger bones, fragments of a hand. It looked as though the King of England had literally fallen apart. Not ceremonially laid to rest, not preserved the way a king's coffin should look after death. This one was destroyed. The scene becomes even stranger when you consider that Henry wasn't alone in that vault. On one side lay Jane Seymour, his favored wife, the one he was meant to rest beside for eternity. Her coffin was pristine, untouched, exactly as you'd expect after centuries underground. On the other side lay Charles I, the beheaded king. His coffin was old, worn by time, but intact. Henry alone had been obliterated. It was as if his own body had rebelled, even in death. People loved the glamour of the Tudors, the drama, the crowns, the power plays. But there was nothing glamorous about this. The surveyor also noticed something else. A dark, hardened substance smeared across the floor near the split coffin. Dried fluid leaked long ago and left to fossilize with time. It matched the grisly stories whispered during Henry's funeral procession centuries earlier. Rumors many historians had quietly dismissed as exaggeration. Then came the discovery that turned unease into genuine mystery. In a shadowed corner of the vault, the lantern caught sight of bones that didn't belong.
Great as that up and without knowing what's inside it.
So in 2013, the big plan was then to take off the lid of this stone sarcophagus.
Not Henry, not Jane, and definitely not Charles. A completely separate set of remains sat there, anonymous and unexplained. No nameplate, no records, just bones, quietly sharing space with some of the most famous rulers in English history. What began as a routine survey instantly became a cold case. Who was this intruder? And how did the most powerful king England had ever known end up shattered inside his own coffin? To understand how it all went so wrong, you have to rewind. Back before the vault, before the coffin, before the burial. The nightmare didn't begin underground. It began while Henry VIII was still alive. In his early years, Henry was the picture of strength. tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, more knight than king. His portraits show a man built like a warrior, confident and imposing. But by the end of his life, that image was gone. What remained shocked everyone around him. Court records describe a ruler who could barely move without assistance. His body had grown so large that he weighed close to 400 pounds. Special lifting devices had to be constructed just to get him out of bed. Essentially a wooden crane designed to hoist a human being. And yet the weight wasn't even the worst problem. It was his legs. Henry's legs were covered in deep open ulcers that refused to heal. They wept constantly, likely caused by poor circulation, severe obesity, or possibly what we'd now recognize as type 2 diabetes, something Tudor doctors had no concept of. They only knew it was serious and foul.
They did it at his behest, but really Henry's motives were purely selfish, either for his own interest.
Eyewitnesses wrote that the smell from the infected wounds was unbearable. It filled rooms before the king even arrived. You could smell Henry VIII before you saw him. Later theories suggested he may have suffered from a metabolic or genetic disorder, possibly McLeod syndrome, which could explain the weight gain, chronic wounds, mood swings, and paranoia that defined his final years. But that remains speculation. What isn't speculation is this: Henry's body was failing fast. He lived in constant pain. Courtiers noted that he looked close to death long before he actually died. By the time January 1547 arrived, his body was already breaking down, which made the job of the embalmers nearly impossible. Tudor embalming wasn't science, it was improvisation. A rough recipe of spices, oils, wax, and linen meant to slow decay. But Henry's body was already overwhelmed by infection, fluid buildup, and sheer mass. The embalmers did what they could. They wrapped him in waxed cloth and sealed him inside a massive lead coffin.
And in the end, it was quite a smooth and easy operation, and it only took 2 of us to lift the lead coffin out of the stone coffin.
Lead was the gold standard for kings. It was meant to trap everything inside: the smell, the fluids, the gases. The coffin was soldered shut, airtight, and that decision sealed his fate, because airtight containers and decomposing bodies do not mix. As Henry's remains broke down, gases built up inside the coffin with nowhere to escape. Pressure increased day after day. The coffin slowly became a ticking bomb. The first signs of trouble appeared during the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle. It was a long journey over rough roads, and one night the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, a religious house Henry himself had brutally suppressed during his reign. That night, something deeply unsettling happened. According to multiple accounts, strange noises echoed through the church. People around could hear the creaking and the groaning, but no one really knew where the strange sounds were coming from. There were even whispers that Henry might have been alive when he was buried. With his body totally betraying him, he looked more dead than alive. With little technology to really ascertain the truth, Henry was laid to rest as he had become more trouble than he's worth. Then people noticed dark fluid leaking from the coffin seams, pooling on the stone floor. Some chroniclers claimed stray dogs wandered in and began licking the liquid before anyone could stop them. To onlookers, this was no accident. It felt like judgment. There was an old prophecy that dogs would lick Henry's blood, just as they did to the biblical villain Ahab. Whether the dog story is entirely true or later embellished, it captures the mood perfectly. People were terrified. They knew something was wrong. The attendants cleaned the mess, resealed the coffin as best they could, and rushed onward. They wanted Henry underground as quickly as possible. At Windsor, he was placed in a temporary vault beneath St. George's Chapel. Jane Seymour was already there. The burial felt hurried. Some attendants worried the coffin was already weakening, but the stone slab was lowered, the vault sealed, and they walked away. They believed the problem was solved. They had no idea the pressure inside that coffin was still building, slowly and silently, until centuries later it would tear itself apart in the dark.
It's just a simple case of getting a knife in and cutting the lead, and it cuts really smoothly. Blocks the cutting blood.
And while Henry's body caused chaos below ground, another mystery unfolded above it. The grand tomb he was supposed to have, the one that was planned, designed, and then vanished entirely. Henry VIII's vanished mausoleum. the greatest tomb England never built. Henry VIII never wanted a simple grave. That was for ordinary kings. He wanted a monument so overwhelming it would silence rivals, intimidate successors, and scream his greatness long after his body turned to dust. This was a man with an ego the size of a continent, and he fully expected his tomb to reflect that. His father, Henry VII, had already set a high bar. The Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey was elegant, richly decorated, and deeply reverent.
Which he had built during his reign as an orbis miraculum, which was Latin for a wonder of the world.
Most sons would have been content to rest nearby. Henry VIII was not most sons. To him, his father's chapel was tasteful, but tame, too polite and too restrained. Henry wanted something darker, heavier, and impossible to ignore. A tomb that didn't just honor a king, but dominated the space around it. And in true Henry fashion, he didn't even start from scratch. He took it from Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Before his dramatic fall from grace, Wolsey was arguably the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He lived like royalty, dressed like royalty, and planned to be buried like royalty. Fully aware that status mattered even in death, Wolsey commissioned an extraordinary tomb for himself while he was still alive. He spared no expense. Italian Renaissance sculptors were hired, the finest black marble was imported, and the design blended continental grandeur with brutal English scale. It was meant to rival anything in Europe, and it would have. Then, Wolsey failed Henry. When he couldn't secure the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry's patience evaporated.
Wolsey dismissed my Spanish confessor and most of my Spanish ladies in case they were spies.
Wolsey was stripped of power, wealth, and dignity almost overnight, and with that fall came the ultimate insult, the seizure of his tomb. Henry looked at the half-finished masterpiece meant for his disgraced minister and, with royal entitlement, effectively said, "I'll have that." But owning it wasn't enough. Henry took one look at Wolsey's design and decided it was impressive, but insufficient. It didn't quite capture him. So he ordered it redesigned and expanded into something monstrous in scale. The original tomb became the foundation for a far grander vision, Wolsey's monument on steroids. Henry's tomb was planned to be enormous. At its peak would stand a life-sized gilded statue of the king on horseback, shining with gold, a conqueror frozen for eternity. Surrounding the structure would be 144 brass statues, yes, 144, crowding the monument with saints, angels, apostles, and prophets, all arranged as if bearing witness to Henry's greatness. It would have been less a tomb and more a theatrical set. Workshops across England went into overdrive. Bronze candlesticks weighing hundreds of pounds were cast. Massive pillars were carved. Detailed effigies were sculpted, including a lifelike representation of Henry himself, made while he was still alive, so his face would be flawless. This wasn't a memorial, it was propaganda in stone and metal. The cost was staggering. Even by Tudor standards, the tomb was absurdly expensive. In today's terms, the gold, bronze, and marble involved would be worth tens of millions of dollars. And Henry, for a while, didn't care. This was his legacy. This was immortality. Then reality showed up with a bill. Henry loved war almost as much as he loved wives. Campaigns against France and Scotland drained the treasury at a terrifying pace. Money that once flowed freely to artists and craftsmen began to slow. Payments were delayed, then skipped. Eventually, they stopped altogether. The Italian sculptors, tired of promises and unpaid wages, packed up and went home. The tomb froze in time. What remained was a collection of massive, half-finished components. Marble slabs, bronze figures, pillars, and fittings, stacked away like the world's most expensive, most useless Lego set. No instructions, no money, and no momentum.
With these things that somebody's going to turn up 6 months down the line with an army at their back, claiming to be the person.
When Henry died in 1547, he still believed his tomb would be finished. His will gave explicit instructions for its completion, assuming his son Edward VI would carry it out. But Edward was young, sickly, and dead within 6 years. The project stalled again. Queen Mary inherited a kingdom drowning in religious chaos and political tension. She had neither the money nor the interest to revive her father's ego project. Then came Elizabeth I. Practical, cautious, and famously frugal, She took one look at the unfinished monstrosity and effectively said, "Absolutely not." And that was the end of it. The greatest tomb England never saw was quietly dismantled. Piece by piece, Henry's immortality was sold off. The black marble base, once meant to support a golden king, was eventually reused for the tomb of Admiral Lord Nelson. Today, you can still see it beneath Nelson's sarcophagus in St. Paul's Cathedral, completely unaware that it was originally meant for Henry VIII. The brass statues were melted down, the gold was stripped away and recycled. The towering vision dissolved into raw materials. The monument that was supposed to make Henry eternal simply ceased to exist. And Henry? He was left behind. With no grand tomb waiting, his burial in the temporary vault at Windsor quietly became permanent. The stopgap solution turned into his final address. A man who planned the most intimidating tomb in English history ended up in a cramped underground space, sharing it with others, sealed inside a coffin that couldn't even contain him. Too small for his ego, too fragile for his body. And just when you think that vault couldn't get any more crowded or any stranger, history delivered one final twist. A political crisis was about to add an unexpected new guest. Another dead king would soon be slipped into Henry's resting place under cover of darkness. But that, once again, is where the story takes an even darker turn. Buried in secret. How a beheaded king crashed Henry VIII's tomb. Fast forward a century. It's 1649 and England is falling apart at the seams. The unthinkable has just happened. King Charles I has been tried, convicted, and publicly beheaded. A reigning monarch, executed by his own people. Europe watched in disbelief. England, meanwhile, was a nervous wreck. Charles hadn't always been destined for that scaffold. He was born into the House of Stuart as the second son of James VI of Scotland. No one expected him to rule at first. That role belonged to his older brother Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, popular, charismatic, and everything Charles wasn't. But fate intervened. When Henry Frederick died suddenly in 1612, Charles became heir to the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland. From the start, it was an awkward fit. Charles grew up quiet, stubborn, and deeply convinced that kings answered only to God. After his father inherited the English throne in 1603, Charles moved south and spent most of his life trying to live up to a role he never quite mastered. An early attempt to marry him to the Spanish Infanta ended in humiliation after an 8-month diplomatic failure in Madrid. Eventually, he married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic queen in a deeply Protestant country. That decision alone made him enemies for life. When Charles took the throne in 1625, the trouble accelerated. Parliament wanted limits on royal power. Charles wanted obedience. He believed absolutely in the divine right of kings and governed as if compromise were a personal insult. He raised taxes without parliamentary approval, dissolved Parliament when it challenged him, and leaned heavily into high Anglican religious practices that alarmed Puritans and enraged Scottish Presbyterians. Religion, money, and ego collided. His attempts to force the Church of Scotland into Anglican-style worship sparked the bishops' wars, drained the treasury, and empowered the very parliaments he despised. By 1642, England slid into civil war. Charles raised his banner. Parliament raised an army. What followed was years of brutal fighting. By 1645, Charles had lost. The new model army crushed royalist forces, and the king fled north before surrendering to the Scots. After months of political maneuvering, he was handed over to the English Parliament and imprisoned. Even then, Charles couldn't help himself. He escaped briefly, cut secret deals, and tried to play both sides against each other. The result was another round of war and total defeat.
Public enemy to the Commonwealth of England. God save the King! Silence!
In January 1649, Parliament made history. Charles I was tried for treason against his own people. He was convicted, and on a cold winter's day, his head was severed from his body in front of a stunned crowd. That's when Parliament realized it had a problem. They now had a dead king. Giving Charles a grand funeral was dangerous. His supporters, still loyal, still angry, could turn his grave into a rallying point, a martyr's shrine, The last thing the new Republican government wanted was a revolution starting at a tomb. So they chose secrecy. Charles needed to disappear. The solution was Windsor Castle, a fortress, remote, secure, far from the volatile streets of London. In the dead of winter, during a snowstorm, a small group of loyalists quietly transported the king's body to the chapel. No crowds, no grand ceremony, no solemn speeches to lay his soul to eternal rest. Just cold stone and urgency. They had to work fast. Inside St. George's Chapel, they searched for a burial spot, tapping the floor and listening for hollow sounds. Eventually, they found one near the center of the choir.
Small scale because it was just really family attending.
Crowds will also fill the castle grounds, the streets of Windsor.
When they pried up the stone slabs and looked down, they realized something unexpected and deeply ironic. They had opened the forgotten vault of Henry VIII. It had been sealed for nearly 100 years. No one alive remembered exactly what was down there. But there was no time to debate history. Charles needed to be buried immediately, quietly, and without a trace. They lowered his lead coffin into the opening. And that's when things went wrong. The vault was never meant to hold 3 kings. It was already cramped, designed only for Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. The men struggled in the dark, their footing unsure on damp stone. The coffin was heavy, the space was tight. To make room, they had to shift things around. This is likely the moment everything broke. Henry's coffin was enormous and already compromised. Years of internal gas pressure from decomposition had weakened the lead. The wooden trestles supporting it were old, rotten, barely holding together. As the men shoved and maneuvered Charles's coffin into position, Henry's coffin was pushed, possibly used as a brace. Then came the crash. The supports gave way, and all of a sudden, Henry VIII's massive lead coffin slammed to the floor. The impact, combined with the pressure inside, was catastrophic. The lead split. The sides buckled. What would later look like a slow-motion underground explosion likely happened right then, or shortly afterward. No one stopped to investigate. They shoved Charles's coffin into place beside the wreckage and sealed the vault. Stones replaced. Floor restored to what it was without marker, without inscription. Charles I vanished beneath the chapel floor, buried next to the king who had once made monarchy absolute. It was history's cruelest irony. Henry VIII, the man who expanded royal power beyond recognition, lay broken beside Charles I, the king who lost it all. One built the crown into something fearsome. The other watched it shatter. Now they were permanent roommates in a dark, forgotten hole. The vault went silent again. Its location faded into rumor until the 1800s. By then, no one knew exactly where Henry VIII was buried. People knew he was somewhere under St. George's Chapel, but there were no maps, no clear records. And then came the accident. Workers were renovating the chapel, digging a passage toward a new royal tomb nearby. Hammers struck stone. The floor gave way. Suddenly, the ground collapsed inward, opening a black void beneath their feet. It looked like something out of a movie. The workers peered into the hole and froze. They saw velvet, gold, massive coffins looming in the darkness. They had broken into the burial place of England's most famous kings.
As its supreme head, and this is the moment that the English Church goes its own way.
The discovery reached the Prince Regent, who loved history and a good mystery. He ordered an official inspection. That task fell to Sir Henry Halford. Halford descended into the vault and carefully documented what he found. He made detailed sketches that historians still rely on today, and he confirmed the worst. Henry VIII's coffin was destroyed. The wooden supports were smashed. Bones lay exposed to the air. Halford even picked one up, a large leg bone, unmistakably human. He noted something extraordinary. Traces of muscle still clung to it after nearly 300 years. Proof that the lead coffin had worked, until it catastrophically failed. But there's a detail often left out of polite history. Before the vault was resealed, souvenirs may have been taken. This was an era when archaeology blurred dangerously into treasure hunting. Rumors spread that a vertebra went missing. Some claimed a finger bone disappeared. Nothing was officially recorded, but the stories persist. Eventually, repairs were made. The bones were returned. The wood was reinforced. The lead coffin wasn't resealed, but the vault was closed for good. This time, a proper inscription was placed on the chapel floor, so Henry VIII wouldn't be lost again. And yet, one mystery remains. Halford reported a third set of loose bones, unidentified remains that didn't belong to Henry, Jane Seymour, or Charles. Who were they? Some historians think they belonged to a child, possibly a royal infant quietly placed there for safekeeping. Others argue they were much older, perhaps the remains of a priest buried on that site centuries earlier, whose bones were simply swept back into the vault during Henry's burial. We may never know. The royal family rarely allows exhumations, and the vault remains sealed. Still, the questions linger. Was the damage only gas and gravity? Or was the vault disturbed more than once? Did grave robbers ever try their luck? Were royal burial goods stolen long before the surveyor arrived? What we do know is this. Henry VIII spent his life trying to be untouchable. He broke with Rome. He bent religion to his will. He built palaces and planned monuments meant to last forever. In the end, he got none of it. No colossal tomb, no golden statue, no eternal glory. Just a cramped vault, a shattered coffin, and a pile of bones beneath the floorboards. The king who wanted to be remembered as a god ended up as a cautionary tale, proof that power fades, monuments vanish, and nature always gets the last word. So was Henry's ending justice or tragedy? And who really was Henry VIII while he was alive? Power, paranoia, and the kings who couldn't escape the grave. Before Henry VIII became a shattered coffin in a forgotten vault, he was the loudest presence in England, larger than life, louder than reason, a man who believed that power wasn't just inherited, it was displayed, demanded, and never relinquished. To understand why his burial ended in chaos, you have to understand how he lived. Henry didn't simply rule. He consumed life, luxury, and authority with the same ferocious intensity he brought to the battlefield, the throne, and the marriage bed. In his youth, Henry was athletic, commanding, and almost impossibly charismatic. He loved to joust, hunt, wrestle, and compete in tournaments. His days were packed with contests of strength and skill, designed to awe courtiers and intimidate rivals. And then came the feasts. Tables sagging under roasted meats, glazed hams, pies overflowing with meat and fruit, rivers of wine and sugary delicacies that were rarities in 16th century Europe. Every bite was a proclamation. Henry was powerful, indulgent, untouchable. Every banquet was a performance. Golden platters piled with venison and peacock, sugar sculptures glinting like jewels, wine flowing in barrels so large they required small carts to transport. Courtiers jockeyed for seats close to the king, knowing proximity was survival. Spices from the farthest corners of the globe perfumed the air, blending with the aroma of roasting meat. Even in this abundance, Henry prowled the hall like a lion, sampling, commanding, reminding everyone that power could be tasted, smelled, and touched. Yet excess takes a toll. A serious jousting accident left him with a leg injury that never healed, and in time infection set in. Deep, weeping ulcers appeared on his legs, and the smell reportedly filled rooms before he even entered. By his final decade, Henry had grown massive, weighed nearly 400 pounds, and could barely walk without mechanical assistance. His once athletic body had become a prison, yet his appetite for power and indulgence remained insatiable. Every meal, every tournament, every ceremonial display of wealth was a reinforcement of the image he believed the world owed him. And then there were the wives, 6 of them. Each was a stepping stone, a tool, a problem to be solved, or occasionally a threat to be eliminated. Catherine of Aragon gave him a long, politically useful marriage, but no surviving sons, leaving Henry restless and frustrated. Anne Boleyn captured his obsession and his imagination.
And Anne actually threatened Cromwell at this point with his head.
Yet her sharp tongue, ambition, and the absence of a male heir made her a liability. Her execution was theatrical, her head rolling onto the chopping block like a warning. Jane Seymour finally gave him the male heir he craved, Edward VI, only to die in childbirth, leaving Henry grief-stricken and paranoid. Anne of Cleves embarrassed him with her appearance, Catherine Howard terrified him with perceived betrayal.
Claims that Catherine actually said it was better to be his mistress than his wife, but if that was the case, he ignored her and insisted on marriage.
And Catherine Parr survived by carefully navigating his mercurial temper. Each marriage escalated his paranoia, sharpening his distrust of those closest to him. Loyalty was fragile. Friends became suspects. Even servants and courtiers were potential conspirators. By the end of his life, Henry ruled a court that resembled a gilded prison more than a palace. His paranoia extended beyond marriage into war and security. Henry lived as though every European kingdom plotted his destruction. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Scotland, no nation escaped his scrutiny. He fortified coastlines, commissioned massive artillery, and built palaces that doubled as fortresses. Guards inspected doors, gates, and corridors endlessly. Watchmen patrolled night and day. He demanded loyalty but expected betrayal. In private, he reportedly slept with weapons near his bed, fully expecting assassination attempts. Henry personally inspected every tower, every cannon, pacing battlements in heavy armor despite his failing legs. He ordered spies along the coast to report French ships months before they appeared.
His flagship was 40 feet deep under the Solent.
Soldiers drilled in the rain and snow, marching tirelessly to anticipate imaginary attacks. The king watched all of it with hawk-like intensity. Convinced betrayal lurked in every shadow, every whisper. His paranoia shaped not only policy but daily life for all who served him. Henry's obsession with immortality manifested most clearly in his tomb. He did not simply want a burial. He demanded a monument so massive and awe-inspiring it would dwarf every other royal resting place in England. Gold, black marble, bronze statues, every saint, angel, and prophet in static witness to his glory. He wanted the final word on history, the permanent assertion of his power. Workshops across England worked for years, casting bronze candlesticks weighing hundreds of pounds, carving intricate marble pillars, and sculpting a full-size effigy of the king while he was still alive. The vision was colossal, gold-plated, surrounded by angels and saints. A monument worthy of the king who reshaped England, but life, as it always does, intervened. The monument that would have symbolized absolute authority dissolved into broken marble, melted bronze, and repurposed gold. Even his successors abandoned the project, repurposing black marble for Lord Nelson's tomb centuries later, melting down the bronze and stripping gold for other uses. The ultimate irony, the king obsessed with permanence left behind only fragments. Yet Henry was not alone in this tragic irony. History is full of kings whose bodies did not obey the dignity they expected in life. William the Conqueror, who reshaped England itself, was so bloated at death that his corpse reportedly burst during burial, flooding the church with a stench no one could ignore. Louis XIV, the Sun King, demanded extravagance in life but had to be buried hurriedly due to rapid decomposition. Medieval plague-stricken monarchs were sometimes dumped in mass graves, stripped of ceremony, forced into anonymity by the circumstances of disease and politics. Even in death, Henry's life left its mark on his remains. His body had been ravaged by disease and indulgence, already compromised by weight and ulceration. Encased in a lead coffin meant to preserve him forever, he nevertheless decomposed internally. When Charles was inserted into the vault decades later, the impact of the new coffin likely shifted Henry's fragile container, leading to the catastrophic split that later surveyors would discover. His obsession with control over marriage, war, monuments, and legacy could not extend past death. Nature, decay, and physics had the last word. The vault had become a time capsule of mismanagement, obsession, and mortality. Even then, mystery remained. Henry's life, full of power, paranoia, excess, and control, finds a grim echo in his death. His body, once the epitome of authority, was reduced to fragments and forced to share a cramped space with a king who had lost everything. Other rulers might have met similar fates, buried hastily, mismanaged, or desecrated, but Henry's story stands out because his life was a carefully curated display of dominance. And yet, that careful display crumbled as completely in death as it did in life, leaving behind a story that is part tragedy, part dark comedy, and part cautionary tale. In the end, Henry VIII serves as a reminder that no matter how vast the power, how how meticulous the plans, or how carefully monuments are crafted, nature is impartial. Wealth, armies, gold, and tombs may awe the living, but decay, chaos, and time ultimately claim us all. The king who tried to be larger than life now rests as nothing more than a pile of bones, a cracked lead coffin, and a cautionary echo of what happens when ambition outstrips mortality. He lived as if he could bend life to his will. He died proving it cannot be done. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.